All right. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. All right. So last week, talked about how family history fuels family feud, right? Like our families are loaded with brokenness and different trends, and different things that are coming through the family tree and being passed on to us, whether we like it or not, right? We look specifically at the family tree of Joseph, which was pretty intense. And we noticed a lot of patterns within the family. What were some of the patterns that we saw? Favoritism. Give me an example.
How like Jacob favored was Jacob's Joseph's father.
Yeah.
Like how he favored him, giving him the clothes, the linen, but made all his brothers resent him.
Right. Good. So that was one example of favoritism. What's another example of favoritism within the family tree?
Jacob and Esau.
Jacob and Esau. Who loved who in that family of four?
Isaac loved Esau more than Jacob, and Rebecca loved Jacob more.
You're right. I know sometimes it's hard to get all the names out, but yeah. All right. So a lot of favoritism there. What other patterns do we see in the family?
Lying.
A lot of deception. Okay. Who's the king of it?
Jacob.
Jacob, right? What does his name actually translate out to be? Deceiver. Right? The example, what was the example of Jacob? There's plenty of examples. Jacob.
Yeah. Both his parents and his grandparents, both of them lied regarding their wives. They called them sisters.
Yes, Abraham and Isaac, both very distant incidences, but both lied about their wives. Okay, we also see a lot of deception between Jacob and Esau. So a lot of deception there. Also, Jacob was deceived many times, and that's how he ended up with two wives. Right, he was deceived by Laban, his father,
And deceived by his sons when they told him that Joseph was killed and he wasn't.
Yeah, deceived by his sons. Good. What other patterns do we see?
I think Abraham and Isaac, they did the same thing where they're kind of scared to admit that their wife is their wife.
Yeah, and that's what Lonnie was saying. No, it's good. That one.
My voice was quiet.
She's right, but she's quiet. There's a pattern of like cutoffs within the family, right? And we saw, for example, when Jacob deceived Esau. And he sold not only his birthright, but his blessing. Jacob, there was a cutoff. Okay. We also see within the family, okay, now like Joseph has been cut off. But there's also another story in between when Joseph was sold and then we pick up the story, so he was sold in chapter 37, and then 39, we pick up the story of Joseph. But there's this other story of Judah, which, Judah makes a lot of mistakes, and he's kind of separated a little bit from his family as well. So we see patterns of cutoff within the family, and we can all kind of think to our own families and say, like, okay, sometimes we're like that uncle that we just don't see come around. Or an aunt or brother and sister that did something within the family, and there's just a cutoff or a separation. So cutoffs within the family tree. And so all these different things played into, this boiling point that we focused on last week about Joseph's dream. And like, we're saying that, hey, if any one of us, the age of 17, told our parents about this dream, like we probably wouldn't have responded in the way, but because of all this built up like favoritism and deception within the family, like there was a harsh response to the dream. Right? That was something that we looked at, and the whole key is to kind of reflect back on our families and say, okay, in my own family situation, right? When I say something or something is said, and there's just kind of that big explosion within the family, why is that? Right? Because family history fuels family feud. Right? And then the last thing that we focused on was this idea of everybody in the family has different motivations. And we looked at just kind of the incident of Joseph being thrown in the pit, how at one point we're going to kill him, at one point, like, let's not kill him because I want to save him because I have the oldest brother complex. And if I'm the oldest brother and Joseph dies, like, it's going to look really poorly on me. So we had, that complex working into it. So that was, which son? It was Reuben, the oldest, okay, who wanted to save Joseph later. And then you had people, brothers who wanted to sell him. So every brother had a different motivation, right? That played into how the events transpired, right? And in our own family situations, everybody else has different motivations. I have motivations behind why I act in family situations the way I do, right? And we don't know everybody's motivation. As much as we think we do, we don't. We all need to take a slice of humble pie. All right. Any questions? All right, let's look. Let's start with an opening question. Do we always reap what we sow? Do we always reap what we sow?
Always
One way or another.
wrong word, but I want to say yes.
Always, sometimes, never.
One way or
Always reap what we
another.
sow, sometimes, never. T, were you going to say something?
Just one way or another. We reap what we sow.
So one way or another, we do reap what we sow. Okay.
Yes.
What about you guys? We always reap what we sow.
I would say that in the ministry of evangelism, one sows, one waters, one reaps. So it's not always you reap what you sow. Someone else might be part of that.
Okay, fair enough. So not all the time do we, based on what you're saying, not all the time do we reap what we sow.
I would argue the point that we still do, but with everything we do, there's always an effect to someone, either directly or indirectly. Whatever we do has an effect, not just on ourselves.
Okay.
It almost dominoes,
Okay.
but eventually it comes back.
Anybody else?
I would say that there are times when you don't reap what you sow, but it's usually when the grace of God steps into the situation. So, like, if you've done something where, the outcome should really not be good for you, sometimes it can still turn out good because of the grace of God.
It's a good perspective. Good perspective. All right. Second question. How do we respond when we feel that we have sown well, but end up reaping poorly? Or maybe better said, reaping sourly. How do we respond with God if we feel that we have sown hard and sown well, but what we reap, for lack of better terms, states?
I mean, I would get frustrated.
It's frustrating. Right?
Agreed.
You might not always do it again.
You might not want to do it again. Like, why work so hard if this is what we reap? Okay.
Or question what you did wrong.
Okay, sometimes it makes you like think back. Did I really like, sow as hard as I thought?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it depends on one's maturity, you might be frustrated or angry as a youngster, but as you get older, you're going to be tried, and you're thankful for it. Hopefully, you learn the lesson and benefit.
What's your response to God when what you reap kind of stinks?
I think it depends.
Try harder.
I just think it depends where you are through the journey. But sometimes I'll say like maybe in the beginning, through your journey, you're weak. So you tend to be frustrated and maybe you don't want to try again. And you tend to have a back and forth conversation, yelling at God technically. But if you're strong in faith, or like as you get stronger and closer to God, even if the outcomes are not what you expect, you're still thankful and it's for a good reason. Most of the times we don't know why, but you just have to have that faith and you just trust him without knowing why. Sometimes.
So there's something that happens with age and experience that allows you to reap poorly, but still be okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Very good. Any last thoughts or responses to the question? All right, let's jump into chapter 39. Who's going to read verse?
Is
Yeah.
it essential that we want the song?
Is it essential that we reap what we sow? It's not necessarily essential because I think, Ed gave a good comment that, within ministry, somebody sows and another may reap. So we don't always have to reap what we sow, right? But there is a clear relationship between sowing and reaping, right? That frequently we sow and we reap from what we sow. But not in every single situation do we sow and reap.
Like in the story when Jacob deceived his father, he was deceived also later in time from different people.
Yeah.
So is it essential to be the same pattern for everything?
I don't think it's essential because, let me put it this way. It may not be essential here on earth that we reap what we sow. But if we keep on sowing poorly and we quote unquote get away with it, there comes a day of judgment where we don't get it. So eventually, we will kind of reap the cumulative of what we've sown, right? When judgment day comes. But in every single situation, do we always, reap what we sow? I don't think so. Does that answer your question? All right.
So maybe not necessarily at the moment, but at the end.
Yeah, I mean, at the end, when judgment day comes, everything will be looked at, right? All right, let's read first 3 verses. Chapter 39.
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar and an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hands.
All right, great. So, Joseph was sold by his brothers. This, band of Ishmaelites come down to Egypt and they're trying to make a buck off of him, and Joseph gets sold to the house of Potiphar, right? When we're in difficult situations, And I think it's probably fair to classify Joseph's situation as like, this is a big deal, right? He was sold, betrayed by his brothers, yada, yada, yada. Like, this situation stinks, right? When we're in like bad situations like this, when we feel like our world is totally like flipped upside down, you know, what are we sometimes expecting from God in these situations? We want a solution. And what sort of solution are we looking for most often?
Positive.
Hey, we're looking for a positive solution, but okay, we're kind of looking for best case scenario. Like, how do we, like, this is really bad and I want something really good, right? I want to see like the magnificent hand of God come in and swoop into the situation and solve it, right? It's frequently what we want. Like, if you were to go and ask Joseph, saying, okay, Joseph, what do you want right now? You're just sold to Potiphar. Like, what do you think his response would be? I want to go back home, right? I'm in a new land, far away, like sold as a slave. Like, yeah, I want to go back home. We want something big. And there's a lot of things to consider, like when we're looking at Joseph's situation. So like, all of us agree, like we would want something big if we were in Joseph's shoes. Not only like is he in his bad situations, but like look at everything that is stacked up against him as a slave, right? He was clearly a foreigner and a different background, right? Language was probably somewhere in the mix of this, okay? Social differences, his upbringing, his like, he believed in the God of Israel. Egyptians believed in a lot of gods. Like this is the reality of the situation with Joseph, right? And then he's bought as a slave for Potiphar, right? But there's something so tiny, and I've never seen this before. There's something so tiny in what happens here, right? So Potiphar buys him, and the second half of verse 2. The Lord was, I'll just read all of verse 2. It says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. You guys see it? Verse 2 is like the money verse. This is what Joseph needed. What am I pointing at? It was like, what is crazy? Potiphar.
One thing the Lord was in the house of the master of the Egyptian, So the Lord was in the Egyptian house.
What is significant about in the house of the master?
Okay, the significance so far represents Jesus, as we are in the heaven at the end, and he wants us.
I haven't looked at it from that. I think you're looking a little too deep. All right. So Potiphar buys him as a slave. If you think of Potiphar, like what does a man of his stature like have? Like clearly he's a high-ranking official, right?
A lot of slaves.
He's got a lot of slaves, right? And where would you envision the slaves to be?
Separate house or something.
Okay, separate house, all right? Really kind of like there's two options. You can be a slave of the house, or you can be a slave of the field, right? You got a lot of land. But Joseph, was in the house of the master, right? It's like, what did Joseph probably want? I want to go home. What did he get?
He got a home, in a sense,
Home.
shelter.
Right? You're in the house, not in the field. What's the significance of house or field?
That's what the actual one.
Okay, it's nicer. Okay, nicer to work in the house. But who's he closer to?
Mhm.
Potiphar, right? So there's just like he's in a closer vicinity to Potiphar.
Can't escape.
not so much escape, but like, what was Potiphar noticing? How God was working with him, how he was a good servant, right? What are the chances Potiphar notices this in somebody who's a slave of the field?
No.
Much, much less,
Yeah.
right? What was the big thing Joseph wanted? I want to go home. All of us in this situation, I want to go home. What does Joseph get? He gets in the home of Potiphar, not in the field. It's such a small thing, and we can overlook it, right? And we tend to overlook in our situations, right? Which we're looking at a bad situation, we're like, oh, fix it, right? Make something happen. And God says, okay, not in the field, in the home. We're like, no, fix it. And he's like, I did. In the house, not in the field, right? It's something small, but it's significant. But if our mind is just so focused on like fix the big picture, we often miss what is small. We often miss what is small. And that small thing that the Lord gave him is what he needed, right? As a house servant, Joseph still had to pull his weight. And Joseph didn't squander the opportunity. He still had to do the work that was called upon him. But the Lord put him in a better situation than had he been put to the field. And it's always important for us to look and say, like, okay, in my situations, right, that are really bad, that are really frustrating, and I want God to fix in a big way. Let's not like be so focused on something big that we miss just the small thing that he does. And he just gives us an ear with this one person, or he sends this one person our way, or he opens up this small door. It's not the door that we want to fix the situation, but he gives us this opportunity, right? We have to be looking for that, right? And begin to turn our attention towards the small things. Small thing, in or out, right? In the field, or out in the field, or in the house. But that is in God's hands. And Joseph was in God's hands, and we see him move. All right? Let's look at verses 4 through 6.
So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance.
All right, great. So it said Joseph had to pull his weight, and he didn't squander his opportunity, right? And kind of these verses that we have that show us a little bit about what Joseph was doing is a beautiful picture of this idea of synergy within the church. Right? Synergy is this, idea that is captured in our spiritual journey. That I make an effort, right? And in that effort, I'm working synergistically with God, and we're working towards the same goal, right? But I have to make an effort, and God makes an effort. It's not like a one-to-one ratio, like I pray, God gives this one blessing, or I read the Bible, and then he gives this one. It's not a one-to-one ratio in this, right? It's I pray, I read the Bible, I make my effort, and God does far more than we're even aware of, but he's working synergistically with it, right? He wants to bless, right? But he's looking for us to work alongside with it. It's this idea of synergy. And, this, when we look at Joseph, right? The Lord was with Joseph. How did the Lord work through Joseph? Well, Joseph worked hard, right? He took this opportunity and he, sowed good seed, and he took the responsibilities given to him seriously. Like, you don't go from slave to overseer overnight. Not even just a slave, but a slave that is from another country, has a different background, different gods, right? Than you. You don't take them and make them the overseer. So for this relationship to transpire, like Potiphar over time has to continually be watching Joseph, seeing what he's doing, seeing the hard work that he's putting in, seeing kind of the credibility that he's building over time, and then begins to elevate it and begins to trust it, right? We don't know exactly how long, but we're talking about a several-year process, right? We're talking about a several-year. God was with him, right? And probably expedited it over a couple of years. But it doesn't cut out Joseph's responsibility, right? And that's what we have to also see in ourselves. Like, all of us have different opportunities before us, right? Between work and school and social networks and all these different things, we have opportunities. And God wants to bless us in those opportunities. He wants to bless us when we're at work with our other co-residents, right? Or co-fellows or co-workers, right? He wants to bless us, but is he going to bless us if we're like at work with the mouth of a sailor, right? Really hard. He requires us to work alongside with him. That means I have to uphold myself to his standards, his values, not my own. We can't like choose to live life however I want and then come and say, God, where are you blessing me? Like, I know you want me to bless you. When you're at the water station, like swearing up a storm, like I didn't think that was the appropriate time, right? He's looking to work with us, but how we conduct ourselves and how we like see our opportunities, right, is really important, right? It's how we work synergistically with God. And what we see with Joseph and Potiphar, is this now changes a relationship between owner and slave to owner, master and slave to master and overseer. What's the key element for that relationship?
Still a master.
Huh?
He's still the master.
He's still a master, but how, like, what do you think that relationship between Potiphar and Joseph is building?
Trust.
Trust,
Mhm.
right? And trust is always something that takes years to cultivate. Right? It's years to cultivate trust. And when we kind of let these like opportunities to like work hard, to conduct ourselves in a godly way in all our respective situations, like it becomes hard, right, for us to grow, for us to gain the trust of those around us. And to what extent was Joseph trusted? Potiphar had no idea what was going on in the house. All I know is like I go to work, I come back, and there's food on the table. I check my statements like every so often, and it's getting bigger. That's all he knew. That was a high degree of trust between Potiphar and Joseph. To reach that high degree of trust takes a lot of effort. And we need to be patient for that. Any thoughts or questions on that? All right, let's move on to verses 7 and 9. It's gonna get rough.
It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has into my hand.
Through verse 9.
There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?"
All right. So as we transition to these verses, we kind of laid this foundation of like Joseph was a man who was trusted by Potiphar, and we trusted him because of his character. Right? We saw him over time. Our character is always going to be under fire. Right? Our character is always going to be under fire. Whenever like we rise or other people's rise, there's always pitfalls waiting for us. And it takes years to build character and just moments to ruin it. And Joseph's heading into that season, right? Where he was, he grew in his responsibility, he grew in his trust with Potiphar. And clearly, like it was noticed. And whenever like, there's, we're in good situations, there's always pitfalls around it. And we have to be vigilant for them. All right. And the clear pitfall now is Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar's wife is presenting him with a series of landmines, right? Landmines for Joseph to fall. Because her desire for Joseph was ongoing. This wasn't a one-time pass. This was like, something that has been brewing and stewing for quite some time. And she approached Joseph, right? And Joseph weighed the cost of this potential offense. He weighed the cost of this offense, right? And he knew why he wasn't going to sleep with her. In verses 8 and 9, what are the different ways Joseph weighed the cost of this offense?
How his master trusted him. He's gonna just betray him.
Good. Point 1, right? Abuse. Are you reading my notes? Very good. Point 1, right? Abuse of trust. Right? He said, like, look, my master doesn't know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. So he sees like trust is going to be shattered. What else?
He knows his boundaries because he knows that even though the wife is right there, that's off limits.
All right. So he knew he had everything in the house except the wife.
Mhm.
Even though like he like oversaw everything. It was almost as if he was the master of the house. But even though he had all this responsibility, he knew his boundaries. And he knew his boundaries extended everywhere except to the wife. Right? Which is really important because whenever we rise in position, whenever we rise in status, one of the first things to go with the accumulation of power is boundaries. Right? With a rise in status, power, influence, one of the things that frequently goes is boundaries. Right? Think about like as you're growing up and like you rise like in the level of trust maybe your parents were giving. What do we do with that trust? We push the boundaries. Right? See what else I can get away with.
Poke the bear.
That's what power does to us. And when we obscure the boundaries, we often make mistakes. How many of us think about our own relationship with God? Like when, we think of ourselves as like having accomplished a lot. You're like, well, God, maybe I don't need your input as much, right? We blur the boundaries. And I think like, I can handle my life. I made it this far, I've accumulated like, properties, and I have like finances, I need you less. We obscure boundaries whenever we have power. But Joseph saw this. He knew that even though he had a high power and position, he can't lose sight of his boundaries. Right? What's the last thing? Sin against God. Right?
Mhm.
Even though he thought about trust, he thought about his boundaries, the kicker of this, right? The one that really summed it up is Joseph knew, right? That his moral code and upbringing or his character was the most important. And he didn't want to sin against them because that broke his character. Yes, it would get him in trouble with Potiphar, but more than that, his character would be broken before God. Right? So when you think of like the situation like he's in, and even just think about like everything that Joseph inherited through his family, right? All like the negative traits and the patterns and all this, right? Joseph matured and he held God's standard supreme to all, not his family standards, right? If you take any one of his brothers, put him in this situation, we got a good TV soap opera, right? But Joseph matured and he held God's standard supreme to everything else. And it's hard for us to break, the patterns of our past, the patterns of our family. But even though our families love us and they give us good things, like, and we've all received scripts, both positive and negative from our family, but we must learn to hold God's standard supreme to all. And falling into sin in this way, Joseph knew like this was a sin against God, above it. And that's what he didn't want. Actually, there's a nice quote by St. John Chrysostom. I'll read it. It says, "Let us not place greater weight on respect for human beings than on God's anger, but rather recall in every circumstance those words of Joseph. How could I do this wicked deed and commit sin in God's eyes? So when some temptation disturbs us, let us turn these words over in our minds, and every unholy desire will be immediately put to flight." Right? When we think about our actions that we're doing, and we kind of go beyond the surface level insults that we can cause by our actions, and then we really reflect on like, okay, but what does he say about like me and God? That's an important part for us to meditate on and think on, because it's going to help us fight temptation. All right. Any questions? Let's go verses 10 through 12.
So it was, and she spoke to Joseph day by day, and did not contend with her or to be with her. It happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, but she caught him in his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hands and fled and outside.
Thank you. So clearly Joseph had in mind what he wanted, right? That he was not going to let this happen. But as much as we make efforts to avoid certain pitfalls in our lives, sometimes there's always a perfect storm. Right? We can try and avoid things as much as possible, but sometimes there's always a perfect storm. And we have to be ready for that perfect storm. What was a perfect storm for Joseph? No one was at the house. If this was going to go down, this was the day for it to go down. Right? Because environment is key. Environment is key. Right? When we protect ourselves from certain environments, right? There's reasons why we protect ourselves from certain environments. Because sometimes there's always that perfect storm. A number of times, I've talked to people and they're like, yeah, I go out with my friends, but I'm the designated driver and I don't do the drink. Okay. 2 months later. Okay, there's this one night, Abuna, when we went out and I didn't have to drive that night. Okay. Environment matters. Right? See this in relationships. We're doing well. But there's this one night when like nobody else was there. Environment matters. Right? And we need to be careful about our environments. There's always a perfect storm. Right? There's always a perfect storm. And like the lead up to the perfect storm was in verse 10. So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day. Right? She was like preparing us. Right? Word, your word. Nice coat today. I like your haircut. You've been doing more push-ups, Joseph? Like, right? She's like feeding him water. Right? Just waiting for this. But Joseph prepared, right? Because Joseph went through why he wasn't going to do this. Use of trust, crossing of boundaries, and sin against God. And he was clear as to why. He had a vision for how he was going to function. Right? When we don't have a clear vision for how we're going to function, right? And the perfect storm comes, we're toast. But when we have a vision for how I'm going to conduct myself and why I'm conducting myself in this way, when we have a clear vision, we're able to withstand the perfect storm. Okay? Let me ask you this. What if you were to define the word integrity? How would you define it?
How you act when no one's watching.
Huh?
How you act when no one's watching.
Okay, how you act when no one's watching.
Mhm.
Anybody else? Good. How would you define the word integrity?
Doing the right thing when no one's watching.
Doing the right thing when no one's watching.
How do you conduct your thoughts?
Okay, how do you conduct your thoughts?
How stable or consistent.
Okay. A stable or consistent something. Okay. I give you my definition and actually like hearing to you. Everybody else, like I wish I would have added a little bit. So integrity, the way I like to think about it, it's congruency between our internal convictions and our external actions. Congruency between internal convictions and external actions. What I should have added to this, no matter the cost. Right? Congruency between our internal convictions and our external actions, no matter the cost. Joseph laid out his internal conviction, and we read that in the previous verses. Abuse of trust, loss of boundaries, or blurring of boundaries, and sin against God. That was his internal conviction. His external action mirrored the internal conviction. Right? No one. What does integrity cost us? Oftentimes, our coats, which is exactly what it cost Joseph. Right? To maintain his integrity, he lost his coat. Because he grabbed it, wanting to make this happen, right? And he left. And he left his coat. Right? And this isn't like just any Joe Schmo coat. Like, this is the coat of the overseer of the house. The cost to maintain our integrity is high. It is high. And it is getting higher and higher for us. Because we live in a society that is very, very targeted, and sometimes it's attacks on us. Right? And it's always trying to attack our integrity. Right? It says like society's like, well, you believe this, but I saw you act like that. What does it say about your faith? Right? You say this, but you actually believe this. Right? You believe in love, but I don't see much acceptance coming out. Right? There's always like these attacks that crack our integrity. Right? And once integrity is cracked, it's hard. Like it's hard for our words or actions to carry any weight. So we always need to be paying attention to our internal convictions and our external actions. And to always work towards congruence. Make sure that they match. Is it going to cost us? Yes, it's going to cost us. Right? How much? Who knows? Sometimes our costs. right? Sometimes our position, sometimes our thoughts. Understand? It's what it was then, and it is what it is now. But we always need to be thinking in these terms. I'm challenging myself to say, what is my internal conviction? And how does my external action reflect my internal conviction? Or lack thereof. Any thoughts or questions? And we're all in the same boat. All of us have an incongruence to some extent. Right? But when we see the incongruence, do we address it? Do we really take it seriously? Because all of us are the salt of the earth. Right? And if the salt loses its flavor, or said a different way, if the salt loses its integrity, it's good for nothing. Good for nothing. We are all in our different places. And we are. When we don't watch this, the integrity of our lives, it's hard to be salt. Right. 13 through 16.
So it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me and cried out with loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home.
All right. His wife stinks, right? Let's see what she does here. Let's pick this apart. When evil wants to get what it wants, it gets ugly. All right. What is she doing?
Framing him.
What?
And the words of my brother, she framed him.
Framed him. Okay. She framed him. But what else does she do?
She kind of goes,
What's that?
I was gonna say, she kind of protected herself to make sure that if he goes and talks to him, to the master, that she has evidence more that she'll be protected.
Okay. She covered her own back by keeping Israel.
I was gonna say the same
Okay,
thing. She
same
went
thing.
around.
Right. So she's got evidence. Okay. Part of her. What else does she do?
She also blames the master, her husband, because she's mocked.
Okay. Who does she blame? You're on to it, Ed. Who is she complaining to?
The people of the house.
The guard,
Okay, so the other people in the house, the other servants,
right?
right? And so in her complaints, what is she actually doing?
She's blaming a Hebrew, or her husband from letting a Hebrew be in the
That's
house.
that's what she's saying. But what is she trying to draw out of it?
She's trying to draw kind of like
Be on her.
yeah, everybody towards her to give
Exactly.
her to back her up.
She's gaining support, right?
Mhm.
She's amassing this attack. She didn't get what she wanted, right? She's upset, right? Now she's in a difficult situation. And she's in a difficult situation because of the relationship between Potiphar and Joseph. So she knows she's going to need a lot more than just a coat. So what does she do? She starts to talk to everybody else, all the other servants. It's it's not every day that you see the overseer of the house run out of the house without his coat. Oh, that's strange. Where's Joseph's clothes? Clearly something happened, right? So they're coming in, and now they're seeing okay, Potiphar's wife has Joseph coat, and so she's saying, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us, right? Mock us in how?
He has better morals than them, so.
What do you mean by he, like, which,
Like
like,
she feels like she's being mocked, maybe, because he like didn't let her do what she wanted.
She's saying
okay, hold
something.
on. I mean, let's make sure we got our pronouns correct, and I don't mean that as a pun, like in correct society. So, who is he? See, he. Who's he?
He, the
Jonathan.
Yeah. So he, Potiphar, has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. Right. So she's saying, like, you brought this guy in. Like, so she's highlighting cultural differences, religious like differences. So she's highlighting all the differences. And the mock on everybody else is that, and you made them, he made him like the overseer, like to say, like, what, we're all Egyptian, we're not good enough. Like, what are you mocking us? Right. So she's playing on the emotional strings of everybody else in the house.
Mhm.
Right. And then she's saying he came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a lot of ghosts. So she's kind of like framing it how she wants. Right. So she's upset, she's garnering a lot of support. Right, because she's gonna need it. Right, kind of creates this like us versus them. Us being like the wife and the household servants, and them being Potiphar and Joseph. So she's creating this division, right? Which is like classic, like this is what evil does, creates division, you and them. All right. Now let's read what happens here. We're going to read 17 through 20.
Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came into me to mock me. 18, so it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, and left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. 20, then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison.
All right, thank you. So 17 captures when Potiphar comes back. And then this is the conversation between the wife and Potiphar. The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice, his garment, da da da. And then 19. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Right? What do you think is going through Potiphar's mind?
Confused.
Why?
Because he has so much, like Joseph built so much trust throughout the years, and like he doesn't think this character would produce something like that. So it's like
Right? There's a huge conflict in Potiphar. I agree. Huge conflict in Potiphar. Difficult situation.
He's pulled in almost in two different directions. He's like, okay, well, this is my wife of I don't know how many years. How can she lie to me? And at the same time, it's like, I put so much trust into this man. How can he actually do something like that? Is it true? I don't. So he could be fighting mad because he can't even understand which way to go at
Yeah.
that moment.
Yeah. Like, I think Potiphar's like totally torn.
Hmm.
Like, man, when you find somebody that you trust your household to, that like grows everything in such a good way, and then you're like, I got to do something. Can't stay the same. What should have Potiphar done? Killed him. Right? That's what you do when a slave violates your wife. All right, a Hebrew slave.
That's what you do.
Right? That's what you do when a Hebrew slave violates. That's what you do when anybody violates your wife. Right? But like, if you're Egyptian and a Hebrew slave violates your wife, like you kill him. Right? But he's so torn. It's like, this doesn't sound like Joseph. And if he really like had significant trust in his wife, she would have been overseer of the house. Right? But it was Joseph. So there's such a huge conflict. What do you think is going through Joseph's mind right now?
He's probably
Praying not to die.
Praying not to die,
he's probably angry.
probably angry.
That's probably extreme, but maybe sometimes if you would feel regret.
What?
Regret,
Regret for what?
maybe he could have just done it to avoid the consequences. I'm just being serious. Some like when things go all the way around or like the opposite way, sometimes you might think like, I just wish I was done it. Sometimes you just have that thought, like in minor things.
Sure, but like, I'm going to challenge that. And what did we read that would go against like Joseph thinking?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I was just thinking. You never know. Sometimes you're very strong in faith, but maybe you expected everything to go well because
Okay.
that's what you
Right?
been planning for technically, or like working on.
But to be pointed, like, because Joseph knew that this would be sin against God, like, and what was important to him was his conscience before God. That's why I would say, like, probably not what he was doing.
I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was our opening question?
Do you always read what we
Do
say?
you always reap what you sow? Joseph is not reaping what he sowed. He sowed hard work. He sowed honesty. He sowed integrity. And he got
Prison.
prison, right?
Probably confusion. Like, when is this gonna end? Like, he's just getting worse and worse and worse.
Okay.
Every time he gets better,
It gets worse. Yeah, exactly. And what
Yeah,
was
at least he has his life.
when he was like in the pit, right? And being sold and carried down to Egypt. I want to go home. He wanted something big. What do you think Joseph wanted right now?
I go to Potiphar.
What?
Once I go back.
Oh, exactly. Like, God, do something to show that she's lying, right? You sent Susanna Daniel. Where's my Daniel? Right? Who's going to come and like in this moment, like vindicate me.
Mm.
Right? Probably what Joseph was thinking. But what did Joseph get?
Prison.
No. What did Joseph get?
Like,
No. Read the text. Which prison?
He's with the king's prisoners.
The king's prison.
Hmm.
Didn't you get when we went to Potiphar's house? Field or house? We got the house. Where did he go when he went to prison?
The king's prison.
Right? Little things.
One step closer.
Something small. The mind always goes to the big.
He's in the big house.
God said, okay, we're going to prison, but it's the king's prison. Right? We got to remember that when we want something big to be resolved, sometimes God just says, show me what to do. Not just in prison, the king's prison. Not just like, any slave in the house. You put your slave in the house. Right? We have to be looking for these small things. We're going to finish them. Any questions? Right. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. We thank you, Lord, for all your blessings in this day. The story of Joseph and your servant. And Lord, so many of us are faced with situations that we want such big changes to. But help us in our desire to want something big, to not overlook the small. Help us to see the small and see it as coming from your hand, knowing that you'll continue to be with us. And please, Lord, help us to also always reflect on our integrity and realize that our integrity needs to be worked on and protected at all costs. And the cost of protecting it is big. but you, Lord, are able to use our integrity for greater things, just as you are slowly using Joseph and his integrity to work towards something greater. You're desiring to use us towards something greater as well. Please, Lord, help us to strive with one another in this effort. In the intercessions where your saints will please you from the beginning. Hear us as we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our trespasses. Lead us not into temptation, but evil. Christ Jesus our Lord, for that is kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. All right, next week, 40, chapter 40. If you want to read it beforehand, great. But that's going to be our focus next week. Thanks for joining us online. Have a great night.